Okay, so welcome everybody to another talk, digging deeper talk with the Theology of the Body educators. We are very, very happy, very blessed. I'm excited that Christine Ward is with us from England. She'll be speaking to us on the topic of 10 Truths of the Human Person, how to present an introduction to the theology of the body. So Christine, I'll introduce you with your bio. So Christine Ward has been married to Tom for 32 years. They have 4 children and live in North Yorkshire, UK. Christine completed an MA through the Maryville Institute in Birmingham in 2011 and completed her PhD also through Maryville in 2017. She teaches the Christian anthropology and sexual ethics. Sorry, 1 second. I lost it here. Sexual ethics modules for the master's program at Maryville, and she also lectures on the sacrament of marriage at Oscott Seminary in Birmingham. I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing any of these words. An extract from her doctoral thesis, an empirical study of the nature of the disconnect between faith and praxis, an examination of the sexual moral teaching of the Catholic Church in light of those electing to marry in the Catholic tradition, has been published by Cambridge Scholars Publishing. She is the co-founder of the Theology of the Body Network UK, an initiative that was launched in September 2020. The aim of the TOB Network UK is to connect all those interested in studying theology of the body, magisterial teaching on marriage and sexuality. The network has run several retreats and talks since its inception and has a database of over 240 members from across the UK. Christine has given talks in many parishes at Youth 2000, New Dawn, and at Fisher House at Cambridge University. So, Christine, thank you very much for being with us. We're very blessed that you give your time and your knowledge to share with us. So welcome. So the floor is yours. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Nick. And thank you to everyone who's tuning in this afternoon. So just to begin, the 10 Truths of the Human Person, how to present an introduction to theology of the body. I think, as we all know, as people interested in theology of the body, it is a hugely complex and dense text, one that we might be familiar with. But when we're trying to present this to those who have not encountered it before, we need to find ways that break it down and make it accessible to the lay person. So this particular presentation that I'm going to go through this afternoon, which will take approximately 45 minutes, is just to show how we can take the first 23 catecheses, John Paul's exegesis on Genesis, and from that construct 10 foundational truths of the human person. And this approach of constructing these 10 truths is therefore attempting to take this complex thought of John Paul II and translate it into a logical and digestible set of stages, which hopefully makes it more accessible to the lay person. So that's what I'd like to take you through today. So the first question I would ask if I was giving this talk would be, first of all, a very basic question. Why are we embodied beings? Why do we exist as embodied beings? God had no need to create the human person. We know that. He could have created the human person in any number of ways. He could have created more angels, more animals. He could have created one sex. He could have just chosen to zap us all into being as and when he wished. But why did he create us as embodied beings? And does that question even matter? So these are really the questions that theology of the body addresses. And of course, we know that the fact that we are embodied beings does indeed matter, because God, the all-powerful, chose to send his Son, the second person of the Trinity, as fully God and fully man, taking on human flesh and blood. So we know that if God himself chose to take on human flesh and blood, then the fact that we are embodied beings seriously does matter. It also means that the richest source of knowledge and truth about our bodies can be found in what Christ himself said and did. So let's just divert to the catechism for 1 second. On the topic of being embodied beings, this is what the catechism says. Body and soul, but truly one. Catechism says the human person created in the image of God is a being at once corporeal and spiritual. So it's saying that the human person is created in the image of God and that we are at once bodily and spiritual. There is a unity there. One way to try and explain this to people, because although that sounds very simple, when we get into anthropology, it can become quite complex. And so one example that I use, which is, as always, an inadequate example, but it's the best I've got. If you can imagine a spoonful of sugar being dissolved in a glass of boiling water, those two become one inseparable solution. And that's how we are as body and soul. So it's not the notion that many people have that our soul is rattling around in our body like a ghost in a machine. It's that the body and the soul form a unity. The Catechism goes on to say that man may not despise his bodily life. Rather, he is obliged to regard his body as good and to hold it in honor, since God has created it and will raise it up on the last day. So let's now move on to John Paul II and his notion of the purpose of us being embodied. So with respect to answering the question of why we are embodied beings, John Paul II said this: the body has been created to transfer into the visible reality of the world the mystery hidden since time immemorial in God, and thus be a sign of it. So what John Paul II is saying here is that the body has been deliberately created to make visible what would otherwise be invisible. And of course, the question then is, well, what is that? What is it that is invisible? And it is the eternal love of the Trinity. That's the mystery that is hidden in God since time immemorial. And really, that's the essence of theology of the body, that our bodies have been designed to reveal and communicate the love of the Trinity. And so if we said nothing further this afternoon, that really is theology of the body in a nutshell. So theology of the body, as we know, is the study of the body as God created us to be. And John Paul II says, through the very fact that the word of God became flesh, the body entered theology through the main door. Our bodies then, the fact that we are embodied beings, is of vital significance. They are indeed theological. And this, of course, will have all sorts of implications when we come on to talk about marriage and when we want to apply this notion to all aspects of sexual ethics. So theology of the body itself, then, as we know, it was the motivation for this on the part of John Paul II was to provide us with a scriptural defense of the church's teaching on contraception. So we know that Paul VI in 1968 issued his apostolic letter Humani Vitae, in which he upheld the teaching of the church prohibiting contraception. And we know that that's also very much a natural law document. It's quite a short document from the Vatican. So what John Paul II was wanting to do with theology of the body was to give us the scriptural apologetic, the scriptural defense for the church's teaching. And obviously coming from his philosophy background as well as theology, he didn't just go straight to the issue of contraception as something that needed to be addressed. He wanted to look at the person who acts. So he wanted to take a step back and examine this notion of personhood before looking at an issue that the person might then choose to undertake. So he really wanted to get to the heart of what does it mean to be a human person, body and soul, made in the image and likeness of God. Because once we understand that, our being made in the image and likeness of God, sexual ethics will then fall into place. So his analysis in theology of the body provides us with what has been termed his adequate anthropology. And of course, we know that adequate in this instance doesn't simply mean just about good enough. Adequate means a comprehensive understanding of the human person. So just to explain the relevance of his approach a little, I've got two objects here, an Xbox and a toaster. So if an alien was to land right now and was presented with these two objects, an Xbox and a toaster, and if he didn't know what they were for, what their purpose is, what their meaning is, he wouldn't necessarily know how to use them. So he might choose to destroy the Xbox by putting bread in it and burn his fingers by sticking them in the toaster. So the point being, if we need to know what something is and what its purpose is, in order to know how to interact with it, in order for that thing to flourish to the full, if that's important for objects as mundane as an Xbox and a toaster, how much more important is it with respect to the human person? How much more important is it for us to understand fully our purpose and our meaning as embodied beings? Because if we don't understand the meaning and purpose of our being created as embodied beings in God's image, we won't know how to make an informed assessment of what actions will help us to flourish and what actions will cause us harm. So we won't know whether multiple sexual partners is a good idea or not, whether contraception is a good idea or not, whether pornography is a good idea or not. So in order to understand what is good for the human person, what causes us to flourish, we need to understand our meaning and our purpose. So as we know, theology of the body consists of 6 cycles, and the first 3 are very complex expositions of certain scriptural texts. So we know that the first 23 catechesis reference Matthew 19, which is where Jesus is being challenged by the Pharisees on the notion of divorce. In the second cycle, John Paul II moves on to the Sermon on the Mount, and he gives a thorough exposition of the command, "You shall not commit adultery, but I say to you, everyone who looks at a woman lustfully has already committed adultery in his heart." So yet again, here he's getting right into the heart, the motivation and the disposition of the human person. And then in the third cycle, he moves on to the issue with the Sadducees. And this is where, if you recall, they were again trying to trick Jesus. They were saying what would happen in the case where a woman's husband died and she, in Jewish tradition, had to then marry the brother. He died, she married that brother, he died, and so forth for 7 brothers. Who would she be married to in heaven? And of course, Jesus ultimately answers them by saying that there is no marriage in heaven, that in actual fact, the earthly state of marriage is a sign pointing us to our eschatological marriage in heaven. And so once we're at our destination, we no longer need that sign to get us there. So what this presentation will do, being that it is an introduction to theology of the body and that it's trying to give a top-line simplification of what John Paul II is teaching, is this presentation will just focus on that text from Matthew, the first 23 catechesis. So we'll just go through exactly how this is presented. So we know that theology of the body begins then with this first passage from Matthew. So if I just read that out, it says, "Some Pharisees came to him to test him. They asked, 'Is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife for any and every reason?' And Jesus replied, 'Haven't you read that at the beginning, the Creator made them male and female, and said for this reason, a man will leave his father and mother and be united to his wife, and the two will become one flesh. So they are no longer two, but one flesh. Therefore, what God has joined together, let no one separate.'" And if you remember, the Pharisees pressed Jesus a little bit more here, and then Jesus replied, "Moses permitted you to divorce your wives because your hearts were hard, but it was not this way from the beginning. I tell you, anyone who divorces his wife and marries another woman commits adultery." So what we notice in this passage, and this is what John Paul II picks up on, is that Jesus firmly directs the Pharisees back to the beginning. not just once, but twice. And he also quotes back to them Genesis 1 and 2 in that second paragraph there. So in his response to the Pharisees on the question of divorce, he's telling them, go back to Genesis. Go back to the place where you will find God's original intention for man and woman. And there you will find the answer to your question on divorce, because it was not that way from the beginning. In other words, in the beginning, there was no divorce. And so this is what John Paul II does. He goes back to the beginning and does a thorough exegesis of the text. So just to show where this beginning is diagrammatically, I think many people find this a quite helpful image, to think of it as a triptych. So we are all in this middle section. We're all fallen humanity due to original sin, but we are also redeemed through Christ, through his passion, death, and resurrection. And we are all hopefully journeying towards our glorified state in heaven, God willing. So this beginning that Jesus is referring to, and the beginning that John Paul II does a deep analysis of, is this time of original humanity, this time before original sin. So theology of the body forces us to consider the state of the human person prior to the fault of original sin, which is probably fair to say not a state that many of us had considered until this was sharply brought to our attention by John Paul II. So by analysing this beginning of original humanity, we are able, with John Paul II, to construct these 10 perennial truths of the human person. And in doing so, in creating these 10 truths of the human person, we're going to be able to answer these questions, these life-changing questions. Who are you and what is your purpose? So let's begin then with the first page of Genesis, because it's here that we find the first fundamental truth of the human person. This is a passage that I'm sure we're all very familiar with, but I'll read it anyway. Then God said, "Let us make mankind in our image and in our likeness, so that they may rule over the fish in the sea and the birds in the sky, over the livestock and all the wild animals, over all the creatures that move along the ground." So God created mankind in his own image. In the image of God, he created them. Male and female, he created them. God blessed them and said to them, "Be fruitful and increase in number, fill the earth and subdue it." So the first truth of the human person that we draw from that passage on the very first page of Genesis is that if we're made in the image and likeness of God, we are of course then de facto dignified beings of supreme value. If we're made in the image and likeness of God, we couldn't be anything else. But there's something else that we notice about that Genesis language. And we notice that it switches from the singular to the plural, which gives us an indication that God is relational. If you remember, obviously this is Genesis. It's centuries away until we meet the incarnation and of course Pentecost. But God is still being referred to on this first page of Genesis in singular and plural terms. So we know that God is relational. So we're made in the image of God, who is a relational God, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, the eternal Trinity of pure love. So the second truth of the human person is that we are relational beings and that we're made in the image of relational perfect love. So I think it's important in today's culture to really explore this notion of love. We can't take it for granted that people understand what this word means anymore. And in the English language in particular, we're quite poor when it comes to the word love because we use it for everything. We use it for whichever football club we like, for chocolate cake, for my husband, for my children, for tennis, whatever it may be. We use that same word, whereas at least the Greeks have 4 words for the word love. So if anyone had to answer a question in an exam as to what do we mean by the word love, there are several answers that might come to mind. People might say, well, it's a powerful emotion or a feeling. It's when you adore someone. It's sexual intimacy with someone. It's pure romance. or it's an unbridled passion for someone else. And of course, all of those are certain aspects of love. But as Christians, when we speak of love, we know that our model is the Trinity, but that's something that we need to remind people of. And we also know that our measure of love is the cross. So what I'll do now is I'm just going to show you a 4.5 minute video clip. Our American guests might be very familiar with it. It's from Team Hoyt. And the reason that I show this is because it does two things, I think. Number one, it shows what we mean by sacrificial love, rather than this rose-tinted romantic notion of love. And secondly, it's to demonstrate in human terms a father's love for his child. And I like to use it as a representation of God's love for us. So there's two reasons for showing the clip. For anyone who's not familiar with it, this is a video clip of a young man who had severe mobility and speech issues. And the clip is quite old, so the quality isn't great. But when he was at last able to communicate, this young man was able to blink onto a computer screen what he wanted to do. And what he wanted to do, the surprise of his family, was enter a race. And his father, as you will see, was not a particularly young man at the time, entered them not just for any race, but for an Ironman triathlon. So that's a 2.4 mile swim, 112 mile bike ride, immediately followed by a 26.2 mile marathon. So I'll just play the clip, and I'd just like you to watch it through the lenses that I mentioned. Number one, the notion of sacrificial love, and number two, the notion of father's love. So I think I find that quite a powerful example of trying to explain the love of God the Father for us, his children, just being exemplified in the father and son relationship there. And also the notion of sacrifice and what the father was prepared to do for his son, and vice versa. So the human person is called to a vocation to love. And that the love that we're talking about is this agape love, a love that wants to will the good of the other, a love that's founded on a decision and not a feeling, a love that's prepared to suffer for the other. And as I said, the Trinity is the model of love and the cross is the measure. So moving on then to the fourth truth of the human person and going back to Genesis, here we read, "Then the Lord God formed a man from the dust of the ground and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and man became a living being." And I've just highlighted there this phrase, blew the breath of life into his nostrils. It's just such a beautiful expression of life being given. And so the universal truth being revealed here, of course, is that God is the source of our life. That we know that our parents come together to create us, but when it comes to our soul, it's God who implants the soul. So in that sense, the human person is a contingent being, contingent on God for our existence. We do not create ourselves. And then moving on in Genesis, we read, "The Lord God said, it's not good for the man to be alone. I will make a helper suitable for him. Now the Lord God had formed out of the ground all the wild animals and all the birds in the sky. So the man gave names to all the livestock, the birds in the sky and the wild animals. But for Adam, no helper suitable was found." And we know, of course, that this is where John Paul II starts to unpack this notion of original solitude, this original experience, and that this original experience has a positive dimension and also a somewhat negative dimension. So what that text shows us is that it's man who is tasked with naming all the animals. It's man who has the capacity, the cognitive ability to undertake this task for God, to name the animals. So God doesn't ask the crocodiles or the elephants to name the other animals. He gives that task specifically to man. And so what happens within the man, John Paul II tells us, is that there is this self-realization, this self-conscious awakening to the fact that amidst all these glorious creatures, there is something different about him. He comes to understand that he is not another giraffe or an elephant, that he is different, that he seems to have capacities that these beautiful animals do not have, that he doesn't act on instinct alone like the animals do, that he seems to have these powers of intellect, will, freedom, and free will, that he has a capacity to be in relationship with God, in a personal relationship with God, and to carry out God's commands. So he recognizes that he is placed in a unique position before God, that he is an embodied being, a body and soul unity in the way that the animals aren't. So the fifth truth of the human person is that we are not bestial, that through the body, through our physical and cognitive skills, man becomes aware that he is unique amidst creation, that he is not a mere animal. And then on the negative dimension, the sixth truth of the human person is that it's not good to be alone. So as wonderful as all these animals and creatures are, and he has named them all, no helper suitable for the man was found. So at this point in time, he's unable to live out his vocation to love as the Trinity loves and in whose image he has been created. At this point, he has no someone to love. He is alone before God. And so this brings us on to the second experience, the experience of original unity. And this is beautiful. This is where God presents man with woman. And we hear this phrase, "This one at last is bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh." And what we hear here is this wonderful and beautiful ecstatic expression of joy and appreciation at being presented with woman. Man says, "At last." So he's seen all of these wonderful creatures, all these wonderful animals, but none of them were his equivalent. And it's only in those two little words, "at last," that he is affirming her personhood. He is instantly recognizing that she is not another kangaroo, lizard, or elephant. She is, he can quite instantly see, another human person. He recognizes that her bodily self is different to him, that she is presenting differently, but equally, he instantly recognizes her as a person, a fellow human being, in spite of the fact they have different bodies. He knows she is a someone and not a something, that she shares the same human nature as him, created body and soul. And so he instantly affirms her equality with him and her complementarity to him, and that they stand before one another. And in so doing, their bodies reveal to them, each one, that they are one another's helpers. And the Hebrew word that's used for helper is ezer kenegdo. Ezer is a word that's used about 20 times in the Old Testament, always in reference to God rescuing or saving his people Israel. And kenegdo meaning standing before or beside or opposite to. So on being gifted woman, man comes to fully understand who he is and what he is as a man and as his purpose. And likewise, she, on being gifted him, comes to understand who she is and what her purpose is. And that together their bodies made sense in a way that when they were separate, they didn't. So on seeing one another and being presented to one another, they are in effect one another's ezer kenegdo. They are one another's divine helper, helping each to understand their vocation to love. So the seventh truth of the human person from original unity is this unity in their shared human nature, that they are created as equals. That God created male and female as embodied spiritual beings, which means that in creating them male and female, they are able to fulfill the words of Christ himself. May they be one, just as Father, you are in me and I am in you. They create, as John Paul II famously says, a communio personarum, an image of the Trinity. In other words, in being embodied, body and soul, they join together personally. It's not just that they join together as bodies or animals or things, it's that they join together as persons in a personal way. And so doing, they form a communio personarum. So their bodies have been specifically designed such that they can live out the vocation to love as the Trinity loves, which, as we know, is gifted love one to the other. So gifts in the same way that the Trinity is eternal giftedness one to the other. Animals, as we know, act on instinct, but the human person can make a choice to make a total gift of self. And then further on in Genesis 2:25, we have this key phrase, Adam and his wife were both naked and they felt no shame. And this is the experience of original nakedness. In other words, at this time, before original sin, they were clothed in the glory of God. There was no shame in their thoughts, in their words, and in their deeds. They could fully appreciate the nature of themselves and their bodies as gifts, as expressions of authentic and total love. And so the eighth truth of the human person is that we're called to be fully integrated. So what do we mean by that? Well, John Paul II uses this beautiful phrase, the peace of the interior gaze. And what he means by this is that at this point in time in original humanity, man and woman would have been capacitated to look upon one another without any lust, without any disorder in their passions at all. That they would be able to look at one another and see the whole person, body and soul, not just see an exterior, as is our case today. That as fully integrated beings, body and soul, they would have had a purity of heart, mind, and will, and all their passions would have been in right order, such that they were equipped to make a total gift of self and an image of the Trinity. So, with respect to the deliberate creation of male and female, we're going to move into this in a bit more detail now. John Paul II says the body must be seen through the hermeneutic of gift. And we know that this phrase, the hermeneutic of gift, means an interpretive key or a lens by which to understand something. So the body must be seen through this notion of gift. He goes on to say the human body, male and female, includes right from the beginning the capacity of expressing love. That love in which person becomes a gift, and by means of this gift fulfills the meaning of his being and existence. So John Paul II is saying here that the reason for us being male and female is that we are then capacitated through our sexual difference to make a total and complete gift of self. And if we think about it, that's precisely what marriage is. At the altar, a man and woman say to one another that they will give themselves to one another exclusively, fruitfully, and for life, i.e., they are making a total gift of self. And they are saying that verbally at the altar. And then on the wedding night, they incarnate the wedding vows that they've stated at the altar verbally. In the conjugal act, the sexual act of marriage, they then enflesh what they have said at the altar. So I give myself to you totally and I hold nothing back. So the sexual act in marriage then is an enfleshment of the wedding vows. And in this gifted exchange between man and woman, engaging in an act that is objectively ordered per se to potential life, they fulfill their existence of becoming an image of the love of the Trinity, which, as we know, is faithful, fruitful, free, and forever. And then just going into a little bit more detail into the body, we can see straight away that naturally a man is disposed towards giving himself to his bride. That is the way that his body has been constructed and designed by God. Woman is naturally disposed to receive the gift of her bridegroom. And these two functions, the mutual exchange, are deeply connected in the whole process of the gift of oneself. The giving and the accepting of the gift interpenetrate, John Paul II says, so that the giving itself becomes accepting and the acceptance is transformed into giving. And I usually explain this just with reference to giving someone an ordinary gift. If I give a gift to you, I am obviously the giver and you are the receiver. But assuming that you receive that gift with joy and delight and a big broad smile, I then receive back your joy and delight. So you become a giver and I become a receiver. And then there is this constant motion of the gift interpenetration of the gift between the giving and the receiving. And then moving on to the communion of persons, the giving and the receiving, inherent in the conjugal act, the sexual act of marriage, actualizes a true communion of persons, finding its crowning glory in the potential conception of new life in the bride's womb. So there is a true communion of persons when two come together in a complete and total way. Such a communion, such a union, that it's possible that a child may be result of this. So the ninth truth of the human person then is that the meaning of being embodied, male and female, is spousal. That together man and woman are capacitated to image Trinitarian love in and through their bodies. And we know that St. Paul himself likens the unity of man and woman as the one flesh to the profound union of Christ and his bride, the church. St. Paul says, "For this reason, a man will leave his father and mother and be united to his wife, and the two will become one flesh." And this is a profound mystery, but I am talking about Christ and the church. So St. Paul is saying that conjugal union can be seen as an icon of Christ, the bridegroom, and his bride, the church. So moving on then to the 10th truth of the human person. John Paul II says, "The body and it alone is capable of making visible what is invisible, the spiritual and the divine. It has been created to transfer into the visible reality of the world the mystery hidden from eternity in God, and thus be a sign of it." And so when we ask ourselves, what is it that is invisible? It's the love of God that is invisible. It is the love of the Trinity that is invisible. And so God, in making us male and female, has stamped, in effect, his Trinitarian mystery of love into our bodies as male and female. And so the human person embodied. Remember, we said at the beginning that the fact that we are embodied beings is part of God's plan, that God is communicating something of himself through the embodiment of us, his creatures. So God has written meaning and purpose into sexual difference, male and female. And the purpose of the body revealed through our sexual difference is to make love visible, to literally incarnate God's love. And so then we have a summary of these 10 truths. So I'll just whiz through them, but number one, we're made in the image and likeness of God, so we are automatically dignified beings of supreme value. We are relational beings and we're called to authentic love. We are contingent. God is our life source. We are not bestial. And so we can start to see on those 5 truths of the human person alone how you can begin to build an apologetic for the church's teaching on sexual ethics. If we're dignified human beings, we can begin to build an apologetic as to why abortion and euthanasia are wrong. If we're not bestial, we can see how we can build an apologetic in terms of sexual behavior and sexual conduct. It's not good for us to be alone, that we are created complementary and equal with a shared human nature, that we're called to be fully integrated in our passions and in our desires. That the reason we are embodied is that we are called to be spousal. and that the purpose of our embodiment is to make the Trinitarian love visible. So these 10 truths of the human person form part of what John Paul II calls his adequate anthropology. And in the same way that we're called to speak the truth verbally, we're also called to speak the truth, he says, in and through our bodies. So if I was talking to you now and I yawned and rolled my eyes, but said, oh, it's lovely to be here and I'm so pleased to see you, quite clearly there would be a disconnect between how I was appearing to you and what I was actually saying. There would be an insincerity. In fact, I would be lying with my body. So if we have a disconnect between our words and actions, we are in effect lying. So in terms of the sexual act of intercourse, as we say, a man and a woman on their wedding date state that I give myself to you until death, to the exclusion of all others. So the vows exclude anyone else from the marriage. It's purely the couple and their willingness to stay together till death. So the bodily actions that they enact on the evening of their marriage affirm what they have said at the altar. So we can see then that in so doing, their bodies align with the truth of what they've said verbally at the altar. There is an integration of their words and their actions. And from this foundation, we can then begin to see how other sexual ethics issues fail to meet this alignment of truth with body and words. So just very briefly, fornication, we could say, says, I just love to use your body. I don't want you. I don't want any more of you. I just want to use your body for now. Cohabitation, it could be argued, says, I love you, but I don't want to commit to you. So there's no desire for any kind of formal union there. Contraception says, I love you, but I don't want all of you. I want you to leave that part of yourself over there. Adultery contradicts love. It says, I love you and I want someone else. Pornography just says, I love your body parts. Same-sex acts might say, I love you, but God is excluded and God is love. It's only marriage that says, I love you totally. So to return then to those two life-changing questions, who are you and what is your purpose? In probing these original experiences, we're able to say that we are unique, embodied persons, body and soul, created in the image and likeness of God, and that our purpose is to be a sign of Trinitarian love. And so with that, I'll conclude. I hope that's all right for time. I've just put a slide there with our email on, so if anyone's interested in signing up to our database, do feel free. But as for now, that's it. So thank you very much for your attention.